I've been following a little bit in the news the downfall or complete collapse of the Skid Row Housing Trust. It's not shocking to me, but I think it highlights a lot of things about the homeless crisis that seem to go really under the radar, but are one of the reasons why the issue is being so exasperated. So to begin, I guess a brief intro about myself. My name is Sasha Struthers. I'm an attorney here in Los Angeles. Practice is landlord-tenant law. So to go into this, the Skid Row Housing Trust was 29 buildings, about 2,000 units in Skid Row. If you're not from LA, Skid Row is a portion of downtown Los Angeles that it's kind of migratory. So it's an area of downtown Los Angeles, but has over time kind of expanded and engulfed more areas of downtown. It is one of the most dangerous areas of Los Angeles. It houses a very large homeless population, and it houses a lot of rundown buildings. So the Skid Row Housing Trust was a nonprofit / developer that oversaw 29 buildings, some of which they owned, some of which they managed on behalf of investors. There were 2,000 units involved across the 29 buildings. So as you can imagine, these buildings were huge. A lot of these buildings, the units were like bachelors, so they're kind of like studios. A lot of them didn't really have kitchens. A lot of them didn't have bathrooms, so a lot of bathrooms were like down the hall. They're communal bathrooms, so the spaces are really small. The Skid Row Housing Trust was designed to salvage these buildings and keep them low-income housing in perpetuity, so that those that were housed in them, which predominantly are very low-income individuals, those who receive Section 8 or some other sort of housing subsidy, would have permanent housing because those individuals were highly at risk of returning to homelessness. The trust itself, earlier this year, it came to light that the trust couldn't handle the buildings. About 1,500 units of the 2,000 were not really habitable. 800 units weren't collecting the subsidy rent, which is typically Section 8 rent. Not collecting rent for 800 units is a little devastating to your bottom line. Even though it's a nonprofit, it still takes money to run the building. Section 8, if you don't know, or if you're not familiar with how low-income housing tends to work, low-income housing usually is subsidized. The occupant, the tenant, the resident, all the same. They pay a very small portion of their income or no portion at all, and the subsidy covers the rest of it or a majority of it. But, a tenant's rent portion could be, anywhere from $1 to, maybe a few $100, and the government pays the most of it. When the government abates a unit, that means that they deem the unit uninhabitable and that they're not going to pay rent on it until the unit is brought back up. That abatement, or they abate it through the period in which it's uninhabitable, and you lose all of that rent. So if it's uninhabitable for a month, you're never going to get that rent portion back from Section 8. So a lot of these units were just like run down. They weren't maintained. They couldn't be maintained. Some of them were so bad that they're not collecting rent. That being said, these 2,000 units are supposed to be housing for individuals. So it's not going to help the housing crisis that these 2,000 units who are housing long-term residents are now going through some sort of management crisis where they're not sure what they're going to be able to do with this building. In this year, 2023, it came to light that the nonprofit says we need to put this into receivership. Receivership is when someone comes in, steps in, and takes over the business and tries to restructure it. Receiverships are common when there's business disputes. So if some, business partners get into a dispute and, they accuse someone of stealing or that's one of them. When you steal like a business or you're being accused that you've stolen it or run it into the ground, you can enter a receivership where someone steps in and runs the business. It's very expensive to have a receivership.
Skid Row receivership in danger of financial collapse, leaving 1,500 tenants at risk. The receivership overseeing 1,500 tenants in Skid Row is on the verge of failing unless a LA Superior Court judge acts quickly, receiver Mark Adams said in court filings.
It's like hiring an entire team to come in and replace your team. So the trust went into receivership earlier this year. Receiver Mark Adams was appointed. I believe in about April. City council wasn't happy with him. They felt like he was overbilling for his time, that he wasn't qualified and wasn't doing what he needed to do. So he was replaced late last month. Part of the reason why he was replaced was City council said, we're going to withhold $10 million that we're going to invest into this, into the trust for these buildings, if we don't get a new receiver. So already we're off to a rocky start. You have a receiver who took over for about 2 months, who then City council basically ousted. It's up to the judge, but City council put their foot down and says, hey, we want him out. New receiver's been put in place. That's kind of where it's at, where it becomes kind of evident that the problems were getting out of control actually was back in like 2016. So in about 2016, the trust, the Skid Row Housing Trust, had a major problem with the residents hoarding. This is very, very common with homeless individuals who get housed, is that they tend to hoard. What seems like trash to you is like their earthly possessions. So they were having a major problem with hoarding, and it was creating such unsanitary conditions that a lot of the staff goes, I'm not going into units, I'm not going onto the property, I'm not fixing anything until you have this hoarding issue addressed, because it's a safety concern for myself, the handyman, the maintenance person. So they hired a bunch of grad students and a psychologist to help with these tenants in getting over in the hoarding and to like de-hoard and get rid of the stuff. Well, they couldn't afford to pay for this. So they stopped paying the psychologist and the grad students, so they stepped away. Then they stopped paying the vendors because they didn't have the money. Apparently the 7 years until this year, they were running on fumes. So at this point, this year, the trust goes, we really cannot maintain this. And there's about 3 reasons why I believe the whole trust failed. Mismanagement, low rents, and the lack of ongoing services to the tenants. So I'm going to go through each one of those. For one, management. Managing 29 buildings, or about 2,000 units, is really, really hard. Management in general with a fully staffed company is very hard. Having management that's dealing with Skid Row, which is housing a bunch of people that are transitioning, who have never been housed, that have a lot of mental health or addiction problems, there tends to be a lot of turnover in the staff. There's a lot of turnover in nonprofits in general. There's a lot of turnover in social service because, in my opinion, there's just not enough people who go into social service. So the people that are in charge, or the people who are more like our caseworkers, they tend to be overburdened and overtaxed because there's just not enough of them. And the homeless population is growing annually. Year over year, the population keeps increasing. But the number of people that are case managers that are going into service is not increasing at the same rate. So a lot of people, leave public service or leave nonprofits because it burns them out. So the management is probably going through this cycle, which any business would go through, but in this kind of environment, also going through the cycle. Then you're not doing the repairs as needed. And part of it is the staff doesn't want to do it. They don't feel safe to do it. Another one is you're not paying the vendors. So the vendors are not coming out. They're not doing their work. And sometimes vendors' jobs is like to do annual inspections or to check that the buildings are being maintained or do preventative maintenance. If you're not paying your vendors, they're not coming out and doing that. Then it came to light that there are 19 of the 29 buildings that are under private fire watch because the fire alarm systems are defective in the buildings and don't work, that they have to have someone monitoring the buildings at on the clock all the time, monitoring them, which is a major drain on your finances. So the mismanagement of it is actually costing them a lot of money. And like I said earlier, if your units aren't being repaired and they're not habitable, Section 8's not going to pay rent on them. And they're losing rent on about 800 units from what I've read. And I'll link below the articles that I'm talking about so you can see where my sources are. So just the complete mismanagement, probably the high turnover of the staff.